When I cook, I don't use recipes. I throw a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bible Geeks Weekly Podcast. This is episode 140. I'm Brian Sheely.
I'm Ryan Joy.
And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in to our very first Training Wheels guided study session that we're going to do together here on this episode. I'm super excited for one reason, because I am staring right now at a beautiful study guide that I could very easily print out if I really wanted to at this moment. And thank you, Ryan, for being such a great designer.
You're welcome. This is such an interesting experiment. It's really fun, though. I'm excited to dive in, and I don't want to say see how this goes because I'm sure it's going to go great, but but to join into a conversation kind of like normal, but with a guide here that anybody else can jump into and follow.
Exactly. And so you can download this guide and you can print it out and have these conversations that we're about to have. We're going to give you kind of an example, but you can do this all on your own. And we're really excited to see what you all do with this. And we're going to be starting off this guided study, this Training Wheels study, with session 1 talking about marital stability. And earlier in the week, we dropped a daily download video, a short conversation starter, and it emphasized the big idea here that we're going to cover in this episode about marital stability. The episode is called Sinkhole Alley. Let's listen.
This is Training Wheels.
Sinkhole Alley.
There's a terrifying place in Florida called Sinkhole Alley, a 3-county-wide swath of land known to Swallow House's Hole.
Imagine enjoying a Saturday morning off, watching cartoons with your family, when suddenly the foundation beneath you erodes, leaving you fighting for your lives in your pajamas.
We like to think of our home as a safe place, but what makes it safe? What's the bedrock on which a stable family is built?
Here's the big idea. The marriage covenant is God's foundation for a stable family.
Jesus says that in marriage we become no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Matthew 19, verse 6. So a rock-solid marriage begins with reverence for God and the oneness He creates, because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, your companion and your wife by covenant. Malachi 2:14.
And as the next verse highlights, our honor for our spouse affects our children. Did He not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? And what was the one God seeking? Godly offspring. So guard yourselves in your spirit, and let none of you be faithless to the wife of your youth. Malachi 2, verse 15.
Sometimes couples split apart, sometimes they drift apart. But nonstop fighting and unfaithfulness will weaken the foundation of your family, eroding the bedrock on which you once hoped to build.
So grow your love for your spouse. Stay on the same page. And work out your differences in a way that honors Christ. Sacrifice for each other, holding your relationship above all others, even above a relationship with your children.
Mutual love and respect act as the reinforced concrete to keep that sinkhole from ever forming. As Paul said, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Ephesians 5:33.
So here's the big question. How are you fostering stability in your relationship?
So follow along with this guided study at BibleGeeks.fm/trainingwheels.
And may the Lord bless you and keep you today.
Shalom.
Okay, don't go anywhere. We're still here. Let's run down, I guess, what we're talking about here in this video.
Yeah, so the big idea we just talked about, the marriage covenant, is God's foundation for a stable family. This is where it all starts. This is ground zero. That sounds bad. This is the foundation ground. Sometimes it's...
Oh, man.
Never mind. So this is the starting point of a family. God created families in the beginning, and He started them by putting a man and a woman together. And from there, we led to the big question.
Yeah, so in the big question here at the end, we're thinking about this for ourselves. How are you fostering stability in your relationship? And if you're in a marriage and you have been in a marriage for any length of time, you know that it's not always easy. You're going to go through rocky times. Maybe ground zero was appropriate. I don't know. But, we all have a responsibility here, as we're going to talk about here in this conversation, to foster stability. And so how am I doing that? it would be real easy for me to say, well, it's all my wife's job, or maybe she would say that about me. But if we take the bull by the horns and say, I have responsibility here, I have accountability here, what am I doing? Then how am I going to foster that stability?
Yeah, exactly. I love that word foster. What am I cultivating in our relationship? And then that leads us to our icebreaker question. So we're starting out with something just to get everybody engaged and going here. So here we go, Brian. Did you ever try to pit one parent against another while you were growing up? And if you did, how did that work out?
I was thinking about this question, and I definitely did try to play the don't tell mom or don't tell dad game growing up. If my mom found out something about me that I didn't want dad to know, well, I would just beg her, like, don't tell dad. Or if dad found out something about me, I would beg him, don't tell mom. As if they weren't talking to each other behind the scenes. But I clearly survived my childhood, so it obviously worked out for me. But it's funny, though, now I think about this question in our home, in this house right now, and like, I don't know that I would let that fly. I don't know if I would let it fly for Ashlyn to say, don't tell dad when she came to mom, because I know she would just come and tell me.
Yeah. This isn't going to just be our little secret.
Right,
we
exactly.
don't keep secrets from each other. Our kids know we stay on the same page. But I do vaguely remember trying to ask a parent for permission for something after the other one said no, like once or maybe twice, and finding out resoundingly that would only make things worse for me. So I think I knew it was dangerous ground from the beginning, especially with dad. We didn't mess around. No playing games. That's not how I viewed any of those. It wasn't like, ooh, what can I get at? It was like, no, danger. Will Robinson, stay back.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
Cool.
Glenn and Nancy were definitely the united front that you did not want to mess with, for sure. I experienced that even growing up as well. So let's get into our first segment here on the episode, and that is Jesus Said. As we talked about in that conversation starter, we were referencing this passage from Matthew 19, and I think it just is so good for us to focus on Jesus' words here, even though they're really challenging.
Yeah, I mean, he's answering questions from the Pharisees here, and they're trying to challenge him, and he has such wisdom, and the ideas that he brings us to are so, it seems obvious if you know anything about the beginning of the Bible once he says it, but it also is a game changer. It's a life changer. It's a family changer once we understand what he has to say here. So he says that the two, he takes them back to the beginning, and he says that they're no longer two, but one flesh. So what God joined together, let not man separate. And they ask him, why did Moses allow it? He says, because of your hardness of heart. Moses allowed you to give that certificate of divorce. But from the beginning, it wasn't so. And then he gives this ruling. Whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another commits adultery. So what do you take from these words of Jesus?
As we start thinking about this segment, I'm just sort of asking myself this really basic question. Like, why? Why, God? Why did you decide to create marriage in the way that you did? And it kind of lines up with so many of the questions that I ask myself from time to time. I imagine like being an alien or somebody who's never heard of Jesus before, like just some otherworldly person who comes in and like is introduced to this stuff for the very first time. And you start explaining it to them like, okay, God wants you to go under the water and come back up in baptism. Like trying to explain that to somebody is like, I don't know why. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. Like he wants you to eat crackers and juice on a regular basis while you sit and remember his son's death. Like, why? Why is that the thing he chose? And here, as Jesus is going back to the beginning, back to that perfect design as it all started out, why is this kind of union the way that it was set up from the beginning? Why did God build marriage this way? And this passage is obviously about divorce, and the divorce aspect of this passage has become a huge stumbling block for people. So if God knew that this was going to be such a challenging thing for people, why did he make a rule that was going to be so hard to follow? As Jesus' disciples would later on say in this passage, like, we should all be really careful about getting married if that's the case. And it certainly was. So why would God make this kind of rule? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons why God would make a rule about a husband and a wife being bound together. And I think the big reason is because marriage models our relationship with God and with Christ, his son. I cannot see the marriage relationship without seeing my relationship to God and without seeing the church's relationship to Jesus. And I don't think you can highlight it any better than like Hosea. As you go back and you look at all the things God had to say about the example he was making of Hosea and how we have sort of that parallel or that analog of a relationship with God where we choose if we're going to be faithful to him or not. And if we break that unity, if we break that fellowship with God, well, then there's going to be consequences. And Ephesians 5 obviously talks about our relationship with Christ, how we are Christ's bride and he's the groom. And again, if we break that relationship with Christ, there's going to be consequences. And that's, I think, why God is pointing out the seriousness of this relationship, because it was meant all along to be a parallel or like a tutor for us to understand how we relate to our Father in heaven.
Oh, man, Hosea is such a powerful,
isn't it? Oh.
Real life dramatization of this relationship. I saw, I think, a YouTube video or something years ago of somebody doing like a one-man, one-act play where he was playing Hosea.
Oh, wow.
And it was so powerful. And
Right.
it was just like seeing what she does and him just continuing to go back and to buy her out of slavery after she sells herself off.
Yeah. And it's so visceral there because like you can all put yourself into that situation, right? Like every one of us could imagine what it was like if we were the faithful one, but our spouse was the one who had gone astray. We would be upset. We would be angry. We would just not be able to get over it. Then we can start to understand how God feels when we decide to leave him. And man, that's, I think, just such a great lesson, an object lesson, really.
Yeah, and I love that you brought it back to this idea that God is trying to show us in this object lesson. He's trying to show us ultimately his relationship with his people, that closeness, that oneness, and it really raises the stakes of marriage. And when I read this passage, to me, the main point is that God created marriage to be a permanent oneness. If we go back to the beginning, we see that clearly. Who makes marriage?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the minister, the justice of peace, the bride saying I do, the groom, fancy proposal, what, within this passage, this idea that can change lives that we have to understand is that God fashioned something new out of the two of you when you were married. And you said, you understand why he made this design, and then you said why he made this rule. And there is a rule here too. Of course, you're totally right. But the design is he made a new creation.
Yeah.
And so the rule is honor that new he made something. You didn't make this oneness with your beautiful ceremony and your cake and the little topper on it. God made one. God made a marriage. God made a family. Jesus says, you're not only trying to undo the doing of God, you're actually ripping apart what God made one flesh, which if you think about that and you take that metaphor seriously, that's a pretty violent picture. God made this one flesh and you're ripping it apart. And it's no wonder that Malachi, in a text we'll look at next, says divorce covers our garment with violence. If you look at what it's done to lots of families, to kids, to wives, to husbands left behind, to our society, to churches. Even we can see it's bad, but God sees us taking what you said, that union he made to reflect his bond with his people, and filling it with unfaithfulness and breaking something that he made beautiful together. It's really a wake-up call whenever you start to kind of take to heart what Jesus is saying here.
Yeah, and I love how you put that. I mean, we can easily start to think like I have created, like Castaway, as he's like boasting about the fire he made. It's like, no, you didn't do anything, dude. You didn't make this bond. You didn't put yourself together with this beautiful bride of yours or handsome husband of yours, or whoever it was. God was the one who made this union and who sanctifies the union. And I feel like this is an important part of this conversation because, this is the Training Wheels series, right? We're talking about parenting. And it is going to be so hard if we don't start out on a firm foundation of stability, if we are not united in the way that God has designed that unity from the very beginning.
Yeah, it's like it's ground zero, man.
No, you just keep saying that.
No, it's like, in a way, you could think of the marriage relationship as a sort of house that these kids come into.
Yeah.
This is what gives them walls and a roof over their head. This is what gives them the care, the support, the structure, the provision. It all happens in the context of these two people who are working together, who care about each other and have brought these kids into the world as a product of their love and their commitment to one another, and hopefully commitment to God as well, to bring about godly offspring, as the passage we heard from the video starter there a minute ago. And so you start to see that everything comes from this starting of the family. It's like a sourdough. You got to have a sourdough starter. This is God's sourdough starter for the family is really putting together two people into a marriage.
Oh man! All right, so from ground zero to sourdough, let's get into our second segment here on the episode, and that is heavy words.
Whoa, this is heavy. There's that word again, heavy. Why are things so heavy in the future? Is there a problem with the Earth's gravitational pull?
So here we're considering the word covenant. And covenant really is a heavy word because it's used all throughout the Bible in some of the Bible's most important and foundational moments, including in Genesis 8 with God's promise to Noah, in Genesis 15 with God's promise to Abraham. All these times where God is making these promises and establishing these covenants, this word in the Hebrew is berit, which is referred to as solemn commitment, guaranteeing promises or obligations. As we look at it from God's standpoint, of course, we can trust God. God never lies. He never lets us down. When he makes a promise, he absolutely follows through with it. But as you start thinking about this word covenant in relation to a marriage, then I have to take the ball, and I have to be the one who has a solemn commitment, guaranteeing promises or obligations. And of course, the promise that we're guaranteeing is that promise we made when we said I do. And so as you think about this word, what do you find here? What do you learn about marriage, especially in all the verses that we find? And also, as we talked about in that video, Malachi 2, verses 10 to 16, there's a really big focus there on the covenant that God talks about.
Yeah, it's hard for me to have a Bible study or a biblical conversation about marriage without going to Malachi 2 at some point. It's so fundamental, so foundational to our understanding of what marriage is. We already said God made one flesh out of you and your wife, but how? What's God's recipe? I cooked dinner tonight, and when I cook, I don't use recipes. I thought a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and kind of taste it. And I like sauces, and I like chilies, and I like, tonight I made pasta. But God uses the same ingredients every time when he makes a marriage. And this is something we learn here in this passage in Malachi 2, 10 through 16 about marriage. God used this recipe of one man and one woman and a covenant that he bears witness to, joining them in this relationship, in this oneness. And he says, the wife of your youth is your companion and your wife by covenant. And when God binds a covenant, he means business. The verb form for this Hebrew word comes from the word cut. So when it talks in the Old Testament about making a covenant, it's actually not, the verb isn't making a covenant, but cutting a covenant.
Okay.
And that goes back to this really weird thing that we see God do in ratifying his covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15. One of those strange Old Testament things. We call it the split animal covenant sometimes. He has Abraham cut up these animals. And I mean, just imagine this picture, right? You take these different animals and you cut them in half and you split them. And then God walks, so to speak, through the split animals in the form of a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch that in this vision or dream floats through these animals. And it says right after that, so that's talked about in verse 17. And then in verse 18 of Genesis 15, on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. So he was using a human practice of the time. You can read Jeremiah 34, 17 to 20 talks about this also. This is something in the ancient Near East they would do sometimes in ratifying a covenant. They would split these animals apart. I mean, just imagine, it's so gross, walking through these bloody entrails as if to say, I mean, this made a big impact on me when I got this, as if to say, may this be what happens to me if I break this.
Yeah.
This commitment is life or death for me. That's how seriously I take it. So it's not a fling. It's not, we'll see how this goes. It's not, maybe we'll stay together for the kids. We'll see what happens. Part of God's recipe is a covenant. And if we can learn to understand covenants biblically, it really does have the power to change our view of marriage. And I tell you, if you go into marriage with divorce on the table, like this is always an option, you always have that eject button, it's going to be really tough to stay together. And of course, Jesus did talk about an exception, and there are things we could talk about around that. But as a rule, marriage needs to be a foundational covenant where we say divorce is not an option. It's not something we're thinking about because we are in this for life.
I mean, you brought up ripping earlier and cutting now. I mean, these were not words I expected to hear as we're talking about being married. Like, that's not usually the thoughts that come right to my mind, right?
It's not 1 Corinthians 13.
No. Love does not rip, and love does not
Captain
cut.
and Tennille songs.
No, but that's so important too, because as we see God's design, as we see his intention, we see that, of course, there's never a good reason for this whole thing to just fall apart and be dissolved. That's not the intention. I love the fact that you put it that way, that it's not even on the table. We're not just thinking about it in the back of our minds. And, there have been times where, we've had difficult conversations in our house, but I'm blessed to know that the thought of I'm going to leave and never come back never even just popped into any of our heads. And I know that's not the case for everyone, but when we start out seeing the seriousness of this covenant, then I think that changes the game. There's got to be a better way for us to deal with our problems. And like the disciples did there in Matthew 19, that really does highlight to me how important the covenant is and how important this relationship is. So tread lightly for sure.
Yeah. So whenever you look at this word, this heavy word, what do you take from this?
Well, I started reading here through this passage in Malachi 2, and I came to the last verse that we were considering here, verse 16, and I saw something that just stood out to me that I hadn't really seen before, where he says, "For the man who does not love his wife but divorces her, says the Lord, the God of Israel, covers his garment with violence." We talked about that earlier. He says, "So guard yourselves in your spirit and do not be faithless." That's the summary of this. Guard yourself in your spirit. And so it's not just about going through the motions, and it's not just about putting on a good show or faking it until I make it or something like that. A strong marriage starts in the heart. That's where it all begins. And for me, I have to guard my spirit. I have to guard my innermost parts, the parts that no one else may see. That's hard because I can easily hide those from a lot of other people, and including people like my wife. I mean, I could very easily harbor very angry, resentful thoughts toward her, but act in a way that she'd never know about it. And I know that what's inside of me is between me and God, who obviously sees all those things. And I need to be very, very careful about the unseen realm of my own heart. And like Jesus told us about adultery in the Sermon on the Mount, it's not the act itself, but it's the thought that starts it that's the problem. And I could very easily start to treat this covenant like it was nothing. And that's going to start in my heart. I'm going to start in my heart not honoring her, not having her best interest in mind, not being sacrificially in love with her. Emotions for us can be really hard to sort out, especially if you're a bunch of guys sitting around having this conversation. We've been trained to suppress our emotions. We've been trained to not think about things that aren't actions and verbs,
Yeah.
Without a wholehearted, integrated self, though, who's all in for this relationship, I'm not going to be living up to my end of the bargain if I'm not taking care of what's on the inside first.
Yeah, that self-awareness, like you say, we're good at doing. Tell me what I need to do to fix it.
Right, exactly.
And trying to just be really mindful of our own commitments and priorities. Where am I putting her in my list of values? I did a lesson on Sunday about honoring your wife. I hit husbands, myself included, pretty hard. I was stepping on toes all over. It was a painful one in a way, but it was from 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. And the idea here in Malachi goes well with that, because in Malachi, it starts out, God's not accepting your sacrifices. He doesn't want your offerings. And here's why. Because you're not guarding your spirit. You're not being faithful. you're being faithless to your wife. You're not loving her as you should. So God doesn't want to receive your gifts. And in 1 Peter 3:7, it says, honor your wife, live with her in understanding, honor her as a weaker vessel and as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered.
That dovetails perfectly into that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, how seriously does God take this? How much you honor and put your wife's value up high and make sure she receives that honor and knows that you're communicating it to her. Well, it will interrupt your relationship with God if you don't do that. He is not hearing your prayers. You have a break in that fellowship because you have not prioritized the wife of your youth.
I mean, this is so important. If raising godly children is going to happen at all, like we really do have to have this deep devotion, this deep commitment with our spouse, and they need to see that. I mean, that's going to set them up to have that relationship with their spouse maybe in the future, and hopefully it's going to lead them to understand that, like we've been talking about, this is all designed by God. You know, we're not just deciding to be with each other because, well, it's convenient and we don't have anyone else to go to, and now we're kind of ugly as we're older. We're not out of options. Like, the reason why we take this so seriously is because it's God who builds the house. And I'm just tipping our hand to the next episode where we're going to talk about that quite a bit, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it relates so directly, even in Malachi 2, as we said in the starter, it relates directly to parenting, the marriage relationship. I mean, just, you know, the difference whenever you're around people who are fighting all the time or who aren't talking at all to each other so that they don't fight, or can't get on the same page, or have totally different philosophies of how to raise a child. It becomes a situation that kids can't thrive in. And God designed a home as a fertile ground for kids to grow and thrive and develop into the people he's meant to be. And I understand that there's a lot of different kinds of families that, you know, there's some kids that are raised by their grandparents, and some kids that are, there's a lot of different situations that come up. But as a starting point, this is God's design. And I think a Christian can look and see that. And we want to bless our kids with that design.
Well, you were talking about the issues that people experience sort of in the abstract. Let's take it a little bit closer to home in our third segment here on the episode. And that is our reach out question. Reach out and touch someone. So I think you have the question this week, and it's about to get real uncomfortable in here. Let's go for it.
Yeah, but you know, that teaser sound really helped me because I got my jazzy pants on. I'm
super
dancing
exciting.
here.
Let's do this.
So the reach out question is, how have you dealt with disagreements in your marriage through the years? And I'm glad you get to go first. No, I'm joking.
I mean, you kind of started summing it up pretty well when you were saying, you know, couples, they won't talk to each other when they know that they can't talk to each other well, or maybe they'll say things they regret or whatever. Yeah, I haven't always handled disagreement well. They say whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And the blessing of a loving marriage is that whatever happens in sometimes heated and intense conversations at home, well, they stay there at home. I could give you a list of things that I've done or said or face down in the arena kind of moments that I've had in just unfortunate nuclear meltdowns over the years. But what I will say is that I have definitely learned that my communication skills are not up to snuff sometimes. And I've learned that the hard way. And I've learned that through a lot of failure. And I think what's helped me the most, as I've slowly, probably way slower than I should have learned this lesson, is just to start knowing my wife, to start knowing Sherilyn, like understanding her, knowing what makes her tick, what she's afraid of, what makes her happy, just understanding her like so well. Now I can navigate a tense conversation just blindfolded. And when I first started out, when we first got married, we were pretty young. I was like 20. You know, I was green all over the place. Like I was not prepared.
I remember.
Oh, man. I was not
prepared. You look so young in those wedding pictures.
Oh, man.
Like
and I'm
14-year-old.
I'm shocked by how young I was. And I mean, I let it show too. And it was not something I was prepared for. But over the years, I have really come to understand what it means to communicate well in my home. And a lot of that has to do with just knowing her, and she knows me. And there are times where, yeah, we're going to disagree on stuff, but learning to let those things go, learning that I don't have to be right or that I don't have to fix a situation, learning when it's the right thing to do to defer to someone and let her have what she needs out of that decision, whatever the decision is. And she does a great job of letting me lead and have the final say. A lot of times there'll be moments where we can't come to an agreement, but she does a very, very good job at submitting. And I am just learning all the time how difficult it is to make the loving choice, even if it's not the choice that I would have made. And so, yeah, it's like a delicate dance that I've broken a few toes on over the years.
I love the comparison to a dance. And there's a quote from a movie I love that says something like, "You just described every great love story I've ever read," or something like that. And I mean, like, sometimes we fight each other, but we're fighting something greater than that. We're fighting for something too.
Sure.
Like sometimes we get stuck in our own selfishness and we're fighting each other, but we, through it all, keep coming back and working because we're fighting for our oneness ultimately, or we would just walk away. I mean, I'm not justifying the fighting. I'm just saying there is a commitment there that I think our marriage wouldn't have lasted without. Sometimes it's really hard. You see yourself in very challenging ways sometimes, and you have to learn hard lessons, and you have to really humble yourself, and you really have to empty yourself and put somebody else first, and And that goes both ways. And I think there's the commitment on the one hand of that hard-nailed, tough commitment of we're not giving up. We're stuck in this together. There's a song, Huey Lewis song, I'm happy to be stuck with you,
yeah.
but we're definitely stuck together. But then there's also this other commitment of I don't want to just grit my teeth and get through. I want this to be great.
Yeah.
I want my marriage to be one of the masterpieces of my life. To quote Steve Jobs, let's make an insanely great marriage, But the idea here is that if we're really committed, that we just keep working.
Yeah.
And I'm the chaser in this relationship. I can't stand disharmony with Adrienne. Sometimes she needs like a moment to cool off. So I've learned that. But, I keep coming after her, not always well, but I don't leave things alone. Whereas Adrienne, what she's great with is she's great at strategies. So we're big on rules and strategies. The first few months of our marriage, there was some door slamming.
Oh, nice.
So I initiated, not so much, but I initiated a rule that there would never be a door slammed. And that has been good for, it's just like you do these things like, okay, that was like week 8 of marriage. Okay, we got that rule down. Okay.
Right.
We never go to bed angry. That's a Bible rule, of course.
Yeah.
We do things like repeating things back to each other. We pray together a lot, which you don't always want to do because you have to grow up and realize that God's seeing all of this, but it really raises your perspective. Here's a weird one. This is weirdly successful too, but for a while, and this comes back all the time, we had this weird thing where anytime anyone was massaging the other one's hand or arm or something or back, they could keep talking and have the floor.
Oh,
so
nice.
Really, this was just a chance for Adrienne to filibuster.
It was like a talking stick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because everybody wins.
Right.
She wants to talk it out. I did it every once in a while, but really, honestly, I just mostly was like, okay, you take it. I want to hear everything you have to say, babe. You just go.
Oh, man.
And it really, you get a chance to connect in all these different ways as you come up with these different approaches. And I could honestly keep going for a while with this. But the biggest thing is the commitment to keep trying to see each other generously. And, you keep speaking up and you keep also listening because emotions are real and life is flying at you all the time. Everything is stressful. And so you're trying to work it out together.
And I think for those moments when you actually have worked it out well, I think that does show, as much as your kids will end up seeing that. Hopefully they don't see the dirtier sides of things where you'd rather them not. But hopefully we have the opportunity to model the good kinds of working through problems that we're able to do with each other and for each other. I know we'll have silly conversations in the car where Sherilyn and I will kind of play fight back and forth just in sort of jesting kinds of ways in the way that we have figured out to do that we both enjoy. And Ashlyn just loves listening to us do it because she loves listening to the fact that we sound like we're so angry at each other. But then she tells us, but I know you're not. I know this is fun for you guys. And we're like, We're like, yeah, this is what we enjoy doing. But it's just fun to kind of model good communication for her. And she gets it. Like, she's soaking it up and learning in the back seat in the car. And it's like, I mean, I hope that I'm able to show her the way that she can deal with these things maybe better than I did when I was first married.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I've heard a lot of people say, especially previous generation, I think really held to this, that you don't have any conflicts that the kids can see. And I understand where that's coming from. I'm not saying it's wrong, but what Adrian and I decided is we want them to see how we work things out. And so we do. We just talk things out right in front of them. And, you know, I mean, most of the time we're not paid. We're in the front seat of the car, or we're, like you said, or we're, you know, in the kitchen, and we're just talking through things. And I think that they are able to just see not only how it's done, but also that whenever there's an issue, it's not a problem that is going to end things. It's not like a real danger. We are always going to have issues, and we're always going to work through them. That's our commitment. And so we just keep coming back to each other, and we talk it out endlessly until it's done whenever we have the time. You know?
Right, exactly.
And yeah, so I think that's a really good point.
All right, so let's wrap this thing up with our challenge for the week. And I think, Ryan, you've got the challenge.
I am ready to face any challenges that might be foolish enough to face me.
Yeah, so this week's challenge is to ask your spouse where you need to get on the same page and talk through whatever issues you both see. And when we don't have alignment and agreement on our commitments, how we'll discipline, how we'll work through problems, how we'll handle money or serve the church or whatever, our oneness is in jeopardy. We have to always stay working toward that same pageness, or the distance can get too far. Because like we said, there's always going to be issues. Things are always changing. So we have to always be collaborating and working through things. And I think marriages, churches, any group, people have this difficulty seeing that the work that you do to get alignment is going to pay massive dividends when you're actually trying to get things done. People always want to be doing, and like, well, we don't want to spend hours in a meeting or in a conversation trying to get on the same page. You know what? Trust me, I've seen it over and over and over again. When you do the work to actually get real alignment on a way of being, then the way you do things, you are way more, there's ease, there's velocity, there's productivity, there's fruitfulness. The whole idea of marriage is a oneness, is a harmony and a partnership. So if we don't have that, what do we have?
And it's almost like the two were created into one flesh.
Yes.
I don't know. Maybe that's a stretch, but
You're going too far there, man.
A little bit.
No.
All right. So we're going to close out this conversation with a prayer. And as we have in the guide, the suggested prayer is that we would pray, Holy Father, help me not separate what you have joined together. So we're going to incorporate that in our own prayer as we close out this episode. So let's pray together. Lord God, we honor your role as our Father in our lives. Help us as your children to submit to your authority in everything. Bless us as we've had this conversation about oneness in our marriages to show up in those relationships in sincerity and in humility. Show us how to build stable homes and give us the courage to follow your pattern and not our own. And Holy Father, help us never to separate what you have joined together. This is our prayer through Christ, our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so next week, we are going to continue this guided study with session 2, getting into devotional normalcy. What on earth does devotional normalcy mean? Well, we will explore that next week. And if you want to watch the video about it, we did just drop it a couple days ago, so you can go check that out. But in preparation for the next conversation, we would encourage you to read Luke chapter 2, verses 22 to 38, Luke chapter 2, verses 41 to 52, and Luke chapter 1, verses 46 to 56. These are all going to be verses that focus on Jesus' young life and Mary and Joseph and how much they were devoted to the Lord.
Yeah, sometimes Mary and Joseph, we don't explore very much how faithful they were in their commitment. The kind of home Jesus came up in, I don't think it was an accident.
Oh, no, for sure. So thanks so much, everyone, for tuning into this conversation. We appreciate you so much. You can find show notes for this episode in your podcast player of choice. You can also follow along with this Training Wheels series at BibleGeeks.fm/Training Wheels. Be sure to check out our daily download videos. They are continuing to roll out over the next couple of weeks. And again, over the next 12 episodes after this one, we will be covering all of these conversations in detail. So you can download this guided study for your own use, and then at the very end of everything, you can download a whole PDF of all the conversations that you can print out. If you want to have a class, if you want to host a conversation in your home, whatever you want to do, we encourage you to do that. Thanks so much for tuning in. Until next week, everyone, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
Shalom.